People always say they want a formula to remember things forever, and that already sounds suspicious to me. Because if I handed you a little equation, something tidy with symbols and arrows, and said, here it is, memorize this and you'll never forget anything again, the first thing you'd have to do is remember the formula, which is a funny place to start, isn't it? It's like giving someone who's lost in the desert a beautifully drawn map, written in a language they don't speak. Let me try a small experiment with you. Think of a phone number you learned as a kid, not one you still use, one that's completely useless now. Chances are you can still recall it, or at least most of it. Now think of something you desperately tried to memorize last week, maybe a name, a definition, a password. Gone, vanished, slipped right through your fingers like a wet bar of soap. That's odd, because you probably tried harder with the recent thing. You repeated it. You stared at it. You told yourself, this is important. And your brain nodded politely and then did absolutely nothing about it. So here's the paradox that always amuses me. Effort is not what makes memory stick. In fact, sometimes effort seems to be the very thing that chases it away. The things we remember forever are often the things we never meant to remember at all. When I was younger, I used to watch people study. They'd hunch over books like they were guarding a secret treasure, repeating lines under their breath, hoping repetition alone would hammer the information into their heads. It looks a bit like trying to drive a nail by yelling at it. Very intense, very serious, and not especially effective. Meanwhile, the brain is happily remembering all sorts of nonsense with incredible precision. The melody of a silly song you heard once. The way the light looked in a room where something embarrassing happened. A throwaway comment someone made 20 years ago that still pops up at the worst possible moment. No flashcards required, no discipline, it just stays. So what's going on? Is the brain lazy? Is it cruel? Or is it following a rule, something simple and hidden that we keep ignoring because it doesn't look like hard work? Here's where I like to play a little trick. Suppose I tell you that there really is a formula for remembering things forever. Not written in algebra, but still a formula in the sense that if you follow it, the result reliably appears. Now suppose I also tell you that most people accidentally do the opposite of this formula every time they try to memorize something. That's not an insult. It's actually very human. We confuse remembering with storing, like the brain is a filing cabinet and we just haven't labeled the folder correctly. So we push harder, we repeat more, we add pressure. But memory isn't a cabinet. It's more like a city, alive, noisy, interconnected, full of strange shortcuts and back alleys. If you drop a piece of information into the wrong neighborhood, it doesn't matter how many copies you make of it, no one will know where to find it. Think about this. If I asked you right now to draw a bicycle from memory, you'd probably struggle. Yet you've seen thousands of bicycles. You could ride one without thinking. Your body knows it intimately. But the details, the exact way the frame connects, the angle of the bars are strangely elusive. That's because your memory didn't store bicycle as a list of facts. It stored it as a relationship between things, balance, motion, pressure, cause and effect. The knowing is real, but it doesn't live where we expect it to live. And here's the first crack in the wall. Memory isn't about keeping information intact. It's about weaving it into a web that already exists. Most of us are taught implicitly that remembering means preserving something unchanged, like freezing a specimen in a jar. But the brain doesn't freeze things. It melts them down and mixes them with everything else it knows. That's why memories change over time and yet somehow feel more solid. They're not sitting on a shelf. They're holding hands with 1,000 other ideas. This is where the trouble starts when we try to remember. We isolate the information. We strip it of context. We say, you stand still. Don't touch anything. I'll be back for you later. And the brain, which thrives on movement and connection, quietly lets it fade. What's funny is that children almost never have this problem. They remember because they're curious, not because they're obedient. They poke ideas, turn them upside down, ask annoying questions, connect them to ridiculous things. And adults look at this and say, focus! When what they really mean is, stop doing the very thing that makes this memorable. So if there's a hidden formula here, it can't be about discipline alone. It can't be about repetition alone. Those are tools, sure, but they're not the engine. The engine is something more mischievous, something closer to play than to work. I once noticed that the things I remembered best were the things that made me laugh, or confused me, or bothered me just enough that I had to wrestle with them. Not because they were important, but because they were alive. They argued with what I already believed. They refused to sit quietly. And in that refusal, they carved out a place for themselves. That's the part most people miss. Memory isn't a passive act, it's a conversation. And if the idea doesn't talk back, if it doesn't surprise you, annoy you, or make you say, "Wait a minute, that can't be right," then it slips away politely. So when people ask for a way to remember forever, I always want to ask them something first. Are you trying to keep the idea safe? Or are you willing to let it run loose in your head and cause a little trouble? Because the trouble is where it starts to stick. If you want, we can keep going from here and start poking at what that trouble really is and why the brain seems to reward curiosity far more generously than effort. Good. Then let's loosen things up a bit and see what happens when we stop treating memory like a vault and start treating it like a playground. Imagine you're at a party. You don't even have to like parties for this to work, and someone is introduced to you. They say their name clearly. You smile, shake hands, repeat it once in your head like a good student. 5 seconds later, the name is gone, completely evaporated. Now imagine instead that the person spills a drink on your shoe, apologizes wildly, knocks over a chair, and then tells you their name. You will remember that name until the end of time. You might forget their face, but the name will cling to you like a burr. Now what changed? The importance of the name didn't change. The effort you made didn't necessarily change. What changed was that the name got tangled up with something else: motion, emotion, surprise, embarrassment, maybe even a little irritation. The name wasn't alone anymore. It had neighbors. This is the key move the brain seems to love. It remembers relationships, not isolated facts. I like to think of it the way you think of cities at night from an airplane. You don't see individual houses. You see glowing clusters connected by roads. Memory works the same way. If an idea lights up all by itself, it's dim and easy to lose. But if it lights up next to 10 other ideas with roads running between them, it becomes hard to forget, not because you stored it carefully, but because you'd have to forget everything around it too. Here's a simple experiment you can try right now. Take some boring fact, anything you like. Let's say octopuses have 3 hearts. That's a perfectly fine fact, but if you just repeat it, it's flimsy. Instead, ask a stupid question about it. Why 3? Why not 2? Why not 7? What a ridiculous creature. Imagine filling out an insurance form with 3 hearts. Already the fact is wobbling, laughing, poking you in the ribs. It's no longer just a sentence. It's a scene. The brain seems to say, this thing interacts. I better keep track of it. People often ask me whether visualization is the secret. Sometimes it helps, but that's not the essence. You can visualize something beautifully and still forget it. What matters isn't the picture, it's the play. Are you moving the idea around? Are you testing it? Are you letting it bump into other ideas and see what happens? This is why analogies are so powerful, and also why they're so dangerous if you treat them as decorations instead of tools. An analogy isn't there to make something sound clever. It's there to let your brain grab the idea with hands it already knows how to use. Take electricity. You can memorize equations all day long, and many people do, and then forget them immediately after the exam. Or you can think of electricity like water in pipes, not because it's really water, but because pressure, flow, resistance, and leaks suddenly make sense in your bones. Once the idea has bones, it can walk around on its own. And here's the sneaky part: once an idea can walk around, it starts visiting other ideas without your permission. That's when you know you're in trouble, in the best possible way. I remember once trying to memorize a list of equations. I did what I was supposed to do. I repeated them. I wrote them out. I tested myself. And they behaved very badly. They refused to stay put. But when I stopped trying to remember them and instead asked, what would the world be like if this equation weren't true? Suddenly they became unavoidable. They showed up everywhere. They demanded attention. It turns out the brain is less like a warehouse and more like a gossip network. It remembers what gets talked about. And ideas that only ever get recited never become interesting enough to gossip about. This explains another strange thing: why teaching something, even badly, makes you remember it better. When you teach, you're forced to connect the idea to someone else's confusion. You invent explanations. You make analogies on the fly. You notice where the idea resists being explained. And in doing that, you accidentally obey the hidden formula. You multiply connections. Notice that none of this has anything to do with time spent staring at the information. You can stare at a page for hours and form almost no connections at all. Or you can spend 5 minutes arguing with an idea and remember it for decades. That's deeply unfair, of course. But it's also wonderfully liberating, because it means memory isn't reserved for people with iron discipline. It's reserved for people willing to be curious in a slightly undignified way. Now, there's a catch. When you start doing this, Playing with ideas, bending them, questioning them, you begin to notice something unsettling. The things you remember best are often the things that changed you. They didn't just add information, they rearranged the furniture. That's why certain moments stick forever. Not because they were dramatic, but because after them, the world didn't quite look the same. The brain marks those moments not as data, but as turning points. So if memory loves change, here's the uncomfortable question. What happens when we try to remember something that doesn't seem to change anything at all? That's where people usually say, well, some things are just boring. You just have to memorize them. And that's partly true, but only if you insist on keeping the idea in its boring form. The hidden move is to force the idea to collide with something you care about. Not artificially, not with little tricks, but honestly. Ask what would break if this weren't true. What would become impossible? What would suddenly be weird about the world? Every idea, no matter how dull it looks at first glance, is secretly holding the universe together in some small way. If you tug on it, something else wiggles. And once you see the wiggle, you can't unsee it. This is where memory stops being about retention and starts being about orientation. You're not keeping facts, you're learning where you are. And once you know where you are, it's surprisingly hard to get lost again. If you'd like, next we can dig into why this works even when the details are fuzzy, why forgetting exact words doesn't mean forgetting the idea, and why the brain seems to prefer approximate truth over perfect recall. All right, now we're standing on slightly dangerous ground, which is my favorite place to stand. Here's something that makes people uncomfortable. When they first notice it, you can forget almost everything about something and still truly understand it. In fact, deep understanding often survives the destruction of detail. That feels wrong, because we're trained to treat forgetting as failure. Lose a word, a symbol, a step, and we say, well, I guess I don't know this anymore. But that's not how the mind actually works, and it's certainly not how it remembers. Let me give you an image. Suppose you hike up a mountain trail once, years ago. You don't remember every twist, every rock, every tree. If I asked you to draw the trail precisely, you'd do a terrible job. But if someone dropped you halfway up that mountain and said, which way is down, you'd know. Not because you memorized the path, but because the shape of the experience is still there. The slopes, the general direction, the feeling of ascent and descent that survived. Memory likes shapes more than snapshots. This is why people can forget the exact wording of a story, but still tell it correctly. They don't remember the sentences, they remember the tensions, the cause and effect, the rhythm of what leads to what, and as long as that skeleton is intact, the flesh can be rebuilt. This is where we stumble when we chase perfect recall. We think the goal is to preserve the surface, but the brain is busy preserving something else entirely, the internal logic. Of course it has to be that way. Feeling. And here's the counterintuitive part that always delights me. When you aim for the surface, you often lose both. When you aim for the structure, the surface comes back more easily than you expect. Take equations again, because they're a wonderful playground for this. People panic when they forget an equation, as if the universe has just revoked their license. But if you understand what the equation is saying, you can often reconstruct it from scratch. You don't need to remember it, you can derive it. And the act of deriving it, even approximately, burns it deeper into memory than rote repetition ever could. This is the brain quietly saying, I don't store answers. I store methods. That's why approximation is such a powerful ally of memory. When you allow yourself to be a little sloppy, to say, well, it's sort of like this, you're doing something essential. You're letting the idea breathe. You're interacting with it instead of embalming it. Perfection freezes things. Approximation keeps them alive. There's a funny consequence of this. The things you remember best are often technically incomplete. You might not have all the caveats, all the conditions, all the precise definitions. But you have a working model, and a working model can be corrected. A memorized phrase can't. It just sits there, waiting to be wrong. This explains why people sometimes know something in a way that's hard to articulate. They can feel when something is off. They can predict outcomes. They can navigate problems. But ask them to recite a definition and they freeze. We tend to punish that freeze and call it ignorance, when it's often the opposite. It's understanding that's too big to fit neatly into words. Now, here's where memory pulls a clever trick. The brain doesn't care whether the words are exact. It cares whether the relationships are consistent. If the relationships make sense, the details can be regenerated. If they don't, no amount of memorization will save you. This is why contradictions are so memorable. When something doesn't fit, the brain lights up like a detective who just found a footprint. wet. It says, that can't be right. And now you're engaged. You're comparing models, you're adjusting assumptions. And in that process, memory is being etched not gently, but aggressively. Confusion, when treated playfully, is a gift. Most people try to eliminate confusion as quickly as possible. They want clarity immediately, like a clean answer that snaps everything into place. But if you remove confusion too fast, you remove the very friction that creates memory. It's like trying to strike a match on ice. The trick is not to wallow in confusion, but to use it. To ask what exactly doesn't fit here. What assumption am I sneaking in without noticing? That question alone can anchor an idea permanently. I've noticed that the moments I remember best in my own thinking weren't moments of triumph. They were moments of irritation, when something stubbornly refused to make sense, when I had to walk around it, poke it from different angles, argue with it internally. Those ideas didn't just stick, they moved in. Now let's tie this back to the so-called formula, because by now you can probably feel it forming, even if we haven't written it down. Memory isn't strengthened by repetition alone. It's strengthened by reconstruction. Every time you rebuild an idea from its pieces, even badly, you reinforce the pathways that make it retrievable. Forgetting, then, is not the enemy. Forgetting is part of the process. It forces reconstruction, and reconstruction is where the learning actually happens. This flips the usual fear on its head. Instead of panicking when you forget something, you can treat it as an invitation. You say, my brain wants me to build this again, not just replay it. That's why spacing things out works so well. Not because time magically strengthens memory, but because forgetting creates the need to rebuild, and rebuilding multiplies connections. Here's another unsettling truth. The brain is not trying to be accurate in the way a recorder is accurate. It's trying to be useful. It keeps what helps you navigate the world and lets go of what doesn't seem to matter until you convince it otherwise by showing consequences, connections, or contradictions. This is why emotion sneaks in so powerfully. Not because emotion is special in itself, but because emotion signals consequence. Something mattered. Something changed. Something at stakes. And the brain says, all right, this goes on the map, but you don't need drama to get there. Curiosity is enough. Genuine curiosity carries its own emotional signature, a quiet tension, a leaning forward. And that tension is exactly what memory responds to. So the hidden formula, if we're brave enough to say it out loud, starts to look less like repeat until remembered, and more like counteract until inevitable. Make the idea so entangled with your thinking that forgetting it would require forgetting a part of yourself. That sounds poetic, but it's actually very practical. When you can explain why something must be true, or at least why it would be strange if it weren't, you've crossed a threshold. The idea is no longer a visitor. It's a resident. And once an idea becomes a resident, you don't have to remember where you put it. It's just there, rearranging the furniture. Arguing with other ideas, occasionally waking you up at inconvenient times. Which brings us to a rather large question, and a slightly unsettling one if memory works this way. If it's about integration, not storage, then what exactly are we remembering when we remember our lives? Because at that point, memory stops being a study skill and starts being something much bigger. Something about how time itself gets folded into the present. And that's where things get really interesting, if you're willing to zoom out just a little further.